Welcome back to Gale Force Winds Season 2.
The Gale Force Winds podcast is proudly sponsored by Newfound Marketing, a digital marketing agency located in St. John's, Newfoundland. Newfound Marketing builds cost-effective digital marketing solutions to help organizations unlock their online growth potential. Newfound Marketing's team of experts works with their clients from start to finish to deliver solutions that convert. Visit our website at newfoundmarketing.ca to find out how we can help your business grow. Newfound Marketing, a complement to your marketing team.
Well, welcome to another edition of Gale Force Winds. I'm Alan Dale, and with me as always, my good buddy from the east end of St. John's, Newfoundland, Jerry Carew. How are you, Jerry?
Doing fantastic today. We're recording this episode, Alan, as you know, the day after International Women's Day. And we certainly enjoy conversations with pretty well anyone who's doing interesting things, has done interesting things. But particularly, it was gratifying to be able to bring some notoriety to some of the women, and the video summary that we did with 34 ladies was really well received. And Jennifer, I don't know you at all, but I know a little bit from what Alan has told me. Again, feel very privileged to have you on this podcast. I attained the very high rank of lieutenant in the Navy over 30 years ago since I served. So anyone who ever reached I was very young when I was a lieutenant. An admiral was a very intimidating thing. So it's just a pleasure to have another female leader on with us, Alan.
100%, Jerry, and leader is a great way to describe it. I've known Admiral Jennifer Bennett for my entire career, and she's had a significant impact on my professional journey in the Navy, and she has impacted this country significantly, and I can't wait to get into a conversation with her today. So, Admiral, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, both to Al and Jerry. I'm pleased and humbled to be one of your guests. And as you mentioned, Jerry, the day after International Women's Day. Whenever I'm asked to do these type of presentations, I always have to think, why me? Why am I deserving? But I'm happy to share what started off as a summer job for me and turned into a lifelong passion and leadership opportunity. It's funny you mentioned, Jerry, that admirals were way out of your stratosphere as a lieutenant. Lieutenant was one of the best ranks in the Navy, but for me, admirals were all old men, black and white pictures on the wall. So I certainly had no aspirations of becoming one, or even a role model to think that I could. So let me start at the beginning. I give you a little bit of background and tell you about how I kind of fell into the leadership opportunities. I've had the unique opportunity to be able to combine two concurrent careers, both of them that involve leadership and influence as a mentor and a coach. I've been a teacher in my civilian career, and I also made a choice the summer that I was in grade 12. No intention of joining the Navy. I was born into a naval family. My dad was involved in the Naval Reserve. In fact, when I was old enough to join the Navy, I hadn't even considered that, wasn't on my radar. And an old chief called and kind of in the style of the old press gangs, told me that I should come down to the local Naval Reserve unit in Hamilton, HMCS Star, and join the summer program. At the time, the Naval Reserve had a summer student employment program. It was an 8-week program, sort of an introduction to the military. Now, I had a great job opportunity as a lifeguard. It was 1975. I was going to make $1 an hour and get a tan. And, as a high school student, that's kind of the optimal job. But I thought about the opportunity that the chief laid out for me in very strong terms. It wasn't my dad who pressured me. And in fact, when I joined, my dad was the senior Naval Reserve advisor, or the Commodore of the Naval Reserve. So the summer student training program sounded like an interesting opportunity. It was a little bit different than what my friends were doing. And I thought, what the heck, 8 weeks, how bad can it be? Somewhere during that 8 weeks, it really struck with me that I was onto something interesting and something unique. And again, in comparing notes with my friends, I was doing things that none of them were doing. And at the end of the 8 weeks, there was an opportunity to be able to continue in the Naval Reserve. There were not very many spots for women at the time. Out of my entire class, there was a selection process to continue with the Naval Reserve, and I was asked if I wanted to continue. So I often refer to my naval career as how I spent my summer vacation, because it was a summer job, and as a reluctant summer student, that turned into a lifetime career of incredible opportunities. So following that summer, I started as a communicator. Things for women in the military were very different at that time. Women could not go to sea. Women could not serve in operational positions, very restricted. In fact, I tell funny stories about our uniforms and the fact that when I joined as a Wren. So my ranks were different than the men. But our uniforms, my first uniform, it was actually one of my favorites, but the uniforms for the women in the military, we were all in green at that time in the 70s. They were designed by a Montreal designer who designed stewardess uniforms. So we looked very much like stewardesses with the bowler hats, the round bowler hats, and we had a short jacket and a skirt. And in fact, our skirt was so tapered that we couldn't march in platoons with men. We had to be in a Wren's platoon because of the shape of our skirt. So there we were proudly marching in the Wren's platoon. We had our issued purses and our white gloves for number ones. Our ranks were also different. As I said, we were designated differently as female non-commissioned members and also as officers. When I was an officer, I had a brackets W after my rank. So as a lieutenant, I was a lieutenant, brackets N for Navy, brackets R for reserve, and brackets W for woman, just in case it wasn't obvious to you. So there were a lot of differences at that time. And people ask me now, why would I have put up with that? But society was like that. Mm-hmm. So we were very restricted, and I enjoyed my time as a communicator. My second summer, I worked at the Olympics in '76. I went off to Cornwallis to do my basic recruit training. I did a couple of summers of training at the comm school on the West Coast. And when I entered university, the opportunity to become an officer was provided. And because my trade was so restricted as a woman in the communications branch at the time, I could only serve in shore postings. I couldn't go to sea. I would be in a message center for the rest of my career. And it sounded like opportunities as an officer might be more interesting. So I transferred to officer training. Again, I hit some walls. There were no choices for occupations for women. There were only 3 occupations for officers open in the Navy and the Naval Reserve, and that was admin officer, logistics officer, or nurse. And so the summer that I transferred, they were recruiting logistics officers, so that became my trade. Had a couple of other interesting experiences as an officer that are quite unique and seem strange to people who are serving now. We did seagoing training. We day sailed, and we did some of the same maritime surface training as our male counterparts, but we sailed in sort of harbor auxiliary vessels, but we couldn't stay overnight. So we would embark into our ship with the male bosun, male engineer, and male CO, and we'd sail from Victoria to Ladysmith, and then we would get off the ship and get on a bus and go back to Esquimalt to stay in accommodations. The next morning, we'd take the bus back to wherever that was, and then we'd sail from Ladysmith to Maple Bay. So we referred to it as the Umbilical Cord Navy, because we could only sail as far as you could get back to Victoria by bus.
Wow.
We were not allowed overnight on the ships, as I said, and but we were given the opportunity to experience seagoing, I guess seagoing life to the extent you could between 8 and 4. There were also some unique circumstances about our training and the opportunities for us, that we were trained in sea logistics, but there were no billets for us to go to sea afterwards. So that was in the 70s, and it wasn't until the mid 80s that the Canadian Armed Forces started to change and open doors to women. So I feel privileged to have been sort of on the leading edge of changes for women and to have experienced that over my career. At the same time, I was training at university to be a teacher. I was quite fortunate that I always had a summer job with the Naval Reserve. As soon as I finished my last exam, off I would go. I did training and employment on both coasts of Canada, and had some really unique opportunities. And when there were no teaching jobs, when I graduated from university, I was able to work full-time with the Navy, and had some great opportunities. As I said, I came from a naval family. My dad was in the Naval Reserve, served for 30 years, and my younger sister and brother also served in the Naval Reserve. So at one point, my father used to refer to our family as the Fighting Bennetts, and that we served for over a century of service. And it's not unique to the Naval Reserve, because a lot of families continued that pattern, but to have followed in my father's footsteps was a real privilege. Through my military career, I had some unique opportunities, not just as a trailblazer, opening doors or knocking down doors, kicking down a few doors, but I was able to blend my two careers. And it's quite funny that in my civilian career as a teacher, I was in a highly female-dominated career profession rather, but in the military, I was a minority in terms of being a woman in leadership positions. So people often asked if I ever mixed up my jobs, or if the jobs helped each other, and I said that the kindergarten students liked to march, but the chiefs and POs didn't like to hold hands and form a circle. So I had to be careful not to mix up those jobs. In fact, at one of the schools I was at in Victoria, there were other naval officers there, and the students would often ask if I could order them around at school, and I outranked a few of them. And so one of my fellow phys ed teachers was also a naval reservist at Malahat. So occasionally I'd yell across the field, call him by his last name, and make him snap to attention. And the kids thought that was great. But it was a unique combination, and I was able to hone leadership skills in both of my careers, and take a lot of the experience from both of them and transfer over. And I think that shaped my leadership style the most, because I was more like a coach and mentor because of my civilian background. So I'll stop there and see if you have questions, and then I can continue.
So much. There's so much to explore there. As I said, I kicked it off saying I've known you, and our paths have crossed a number of times over the last, I guess 3.5 decades. But I've always enjoyed your ability to be very conversational with people and really make people feel comfortable in your description of the chiefs and POs not wanting to hold hands in a circle. It's that type of comment that I remember so much from you, your ability to walk into a situation and make everybody feel comfortable and want to share it. And that's, I always admired that about you. Tell me this, and this is a tough question. Do you remember the chief's name that pressured you to join the Naval Reserve?
Yes, I do. Chief Billy Ross. Chief Petty Officer. In fact, he was quite a character at HMCS Star. And just as a sidebar, we spent a lot of time sort of hanging out at the local Naval Reserve Division. Lots of the dads would take the kids down to run around the drill deck, the large sort of gym space for those of you who don't speak Navy. And it was always a great winter activity or a rainy day activity. And dads would load the kids' bikes into the back of the station wagon, and we'd all go down. And there was a gun mount on the drill deck, as many Naval Reserve units had at the time. And we'd all go and run around. And so often we'd go to have lunch at the chief's mess, which would be a pickled egg or a sausage and a bag of chips, which you weren't allowed to tell your mother you'd had lunch in the chief's mess. But it was fond memories. And in fact, I thought if I was ever going to join the Navy, I'd like to be a chief. Little did I know that you couldn't just select your rank and join. But I always had a fond affinity, excuse me, for the chiefs and PO's mess. And some of those chiefs babysat us over the years and probably taught us a few bad habits or salty language. But it was a real family atmosphere in the Naval Reserve. And that's probably why I hadn't thought of it as a career choice, because it was a family atmosphere. And when my dad was in various leadership positions in Star and as the executive officer and the commanding officer, we just attended these things. And it was a really unique sort of family connection. So it wasn't a surprise that Chief Petty Officer Billy Ross, who had taken us out. In fact, one of my birthday parties had taken us out on the Plainsville, the tug at HMCS Star. But he called, and years later, in fact, when I took command of HMCS Malahat in Victoria, the chief clerk told me that there was a voicemail message on the day of my change of command. And there was a gruff old voice that said, "Jennifer, it's Billy Ross." And, he sort of gave me a well done. And you're both laughing because you can hear the chief's voice.
Yeah.
But it was a unique relationship. Now, it also meant the pressure was on throughout my career because I had all of these chiefs watching me. But I think, Al, to speak to your point, I thank you for bringing that up, because I think that's a great source of pride to me that I have always been an approachable leader, and my dad was as well. I followed in his footsteps, but that's something that the Navy allowed me to be me, and if they didn't allow me, I was just going to be me anyway. And I think at times the elementary school teacher in me came out, whether it was at the highest levels as an admiral or a member of Armed Forces Council giving advice to the Chief of the Defense Staff, or in my early days. And I think as well, my experience first as being, as we say, in the lower decks, so having experience as a sailor, gave me a bit more credibility and understanding as an officer.
What you have witnessed in the Navy in the 70s and the 80s and must give you an amazing perspective on where the Navy is going today, because I see really great things over the horizon for the Navy, not only in new ships and new technology and an evolving workforce and the Navy's ability to adapt to that, through culture change and their desire to mentor one another. Good things are happening in that organization and that institution. There's no doubt about it. You approach it having seen the way it was, so you must be so excited to see the direction the Navy is taking right now.
And not just the Navy, but the Canadian Armed Forces, and in particular the opportunities for women and how things have changed. And when I'm speaking about my career, today's generation of women in the Navy or across the Canadian Armed Forces think it's so strange. They find it so foreign that any doors would be closed or that opportunities wouldn't be available to them. And I think it's I also am humbled that I'm considered a trailblazer and a first, because there were many before me. The Wrens, for example, the 3 women's services. It was the wartime service of women who stepped up and filled jobs of men that opened the doors for me to influence change and for today's generation. One of the most unique experiences that I had was helping other nations to integrate women and open doors for women, and assisting across the UN and NATO nations to look at the opportunities and to expand diversity, not just for women, but to look at diversity and inclusion. And it's funny that those of us who I tell the tales about being a first, and people always made a big deal about that, about being a first, or and there are some funny stories. In fact, not only was it in the 70s and 80s when there were restrictions, but even when I was promoted to Commodore in 2007, I couldn't get pieces of kit because there had been so few females of that rank. They didn't have women's shoulder boards, and they didn't have that our bowlers had to be specially made. And of course, every time someone reached a new rank or a new position, there was always the I had to laugh, because when I was promoted to Commodore, and we had to get all the pieces of kit organized, I found the person who was responsible for shoulder boards, and he told me that he was prepping and going to make them with two and three maple leafs just in case. So that was really handy when I was promoted to admiral, that they were ready. But it was funny because I couldn't wear my uniform. I was promoted in National Defence Headquarters by the Admiral in a conference room, but I couldn't go ashore, leave the building, because I didn't have the right hat. I had one set of slip-ons that were okay, but it took a little while for them to get us organized. So, even in some of the considerations when the forces was integrating women, there were all kinds of things that people hadn't thought about, that one size doesn't fit all. And I think, we've come so far that those funny little, the fact I couldn't march in the platoon with men because we didn't have trousers, we had skirts. Yeah. So I'm really delighted with where we've come. Now, are we there yet? You can ask. And what is the critical mass we need to achieve? Still lots of work to do, but the opportunities are limitless now for women who choose to join the military and serve. And I think the Navy has been very progressive. It took us a long time to consider integration on ships. There were funny stories there as well about mixed gender units. Yeah. And I was a CO at the time, and met with other COs who were having a panic about what to do about things like dress for going ashore, and what to wear for sports, and what to do about heads or bathrooms for in civilian speak. And the simplest things became, people were just sort of gender perplexed. And I would say to the COs, what's your rule at home? You live in a mixed gender unit at home. Do you have rules about wearing a house coat to and from the bathroom, or closing the door, or, use those rules? And because women, before they've joined the Navy, have lived in a mixed gender world. But again, I think it took a huge cultural and generational shift to get to where we were. I had another unique opportunity to be the champion for women in defense, and to be able to bring forward issues and concerns, and see a great amount of change there. So yeah, tremendous. But I have my experience to thank for standing on the shoulders of those who went before me.
Right. Yeah, 100%. And I remember being on destroyers when they became mixed gender units, and going through all that. And it seemed in the moment challenging and complicated, but then it just seemed to disappear. It was like, this was just common sense all along. And as you so rightly point out.
Well, I think if you don't make a big deal about it, it isn't a big deal. Right. And I think people look for the worst case scenario in that. it was also kind of funny in my career, as I say, being a first, where people always wanted to focus on that, and it put increased pressure on anyone who was a first, and that's not just for women, but the first of anything. So the first to wear a hijab, the first Black person, the first visible minority, any of that, and it takes away from the people's experience. And I used to say that career boards didn't involve chromosomes as a selection criteria. And when I'm speaking about the difference in career paths between military and civilian careers, I think the military has a much better system, because you're evaluated on a level playing field against criteria that are set and understood. And while it's difficult, other people make decisions. In civilian careers, we limit ourselves. You sort of open the classified and you look at jobs and say, oh, I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that. But if someone else said to you, hey, Al, you'd be great for this job, and they gave you a little push, you'd be more willing to do that. And the fact that in the military, we change jobs every 3 years, or you kind of got pushed into positions. In my case, as I rose through the ranks, and especially as a Commodore and as an Admiral, the institutional leadership jobs were really hard, very difficult. And I probably wouldn't have put my hand up for some of them. But because someone else decided I was ready and had the experience, you were given that opportunity. And I think that's been great for career progression and to push people outside their comfort zone.
Jennifer, sorry, Alan, I just want to jump in there. Jennifer, being a trailblazer like you have been, there must have been times where you've had to have some conversations with some of the old boys club. Do you remember any kind of education that you had to give to some of these people, or anything that comes to mind?
Thanks for that question, Jerry. It wasn't just educating the old white guys. Also had to sit down with women,
Interesting.
and and have those divisional officer chats, because of women being integrated, and those were interesting. When I hear back from people about when I was a lieutenant or a lieutenant commander and their divisional officer, the fireside chats I had, and the advice I gave them, those were interesting times. But yes, I did not as much advice, but apply common sense, and I did a lot of that in my time being at the table as a leader, and reminding people about a wider perspective, and not squaring people off, but just bringing a different perspective to the table. And a lot of that in the early days, because it was a very male-dominated organization. But I think there was as much advice given to men as there was to women.
That's fascinating, Alan, when you think about it. I guess some women accepted the role they were in. So it seems, I love your response, because it's not only men that need sometimes that little push. Some of the women that are complicit in those types of old school relationship type environments, I guess. Oh, it's a fascinating answer.
Admiral, we've Jerry and I have had the privilege of speaking to a lot of people that are currently serving. Indeed, we did a full podcast on board one of the frigates just recently, and it was amazing how many of those people had come through the cadet program and how highly they spoke of the cadet program. In many of them, it was foundational to not only their military career, but who they were as a person. And I know that you had the privilege of leading that organization and the reserve coupled together. Tell us a little bit about what that meant to you, because that had to be quite an honor.
Thanks for that question. Another interesting sort of early day was that I was not a product of the Sea Cadet program. You would have thought that with my dad in the Navy, we would have been steered towards the cadet program, but that was another program that didn't have girls until 1975, which was the same year that I joined the Naval Reserve. So I didn't have firsthand knowledge. They had renettes, but it was a sort of a girls' version of cadets. I had a couple of opportunities to be involved with cadets and to influence that program, and I really took it to heart with my teaching background and my teaching career. As a commanding officer of a Naval Reserve Division, we supported Navy League Cadet Corps and Sea Cadet Corps, and I did training for the officers, and that was a great opportunity. I was a very popular guest for annual cadet reviews and presentations, being a female leader. As the director of reserves, when I was a captain, I was the branch advisor for the adult leaders of the cadet program and was able to influence that. And then as the chief of reserves and cadets, one of my positions as an admiral in National Defence Headquarters, I was responsible for the two youth programs, the Junior Canadian Rangers and the cadet programs with Sea Cadets, Air Cadets, and Army Cadets. That is an incredible program. The cadets that I met and the Junior Canadian Rangers, incredible Canadian citizens. They are setting themselves apart from their peers. I was at one of the Army Cadet camps, Rocky Mountain camp out in Alberta, and there was a cadet sergeant who was the photographer, and as she was swiring me around and I'm touring and I'm doing all these things I should have been much younger to be doing, as I'm rappelling and rock climbing and kayaking. And I asked her if she'd been at Rocky Mountain the summer before, and she said, no, last year I was climbing Mount Everest. And I sort of looked at her and said, really? And she said, well, not the whole thing. You know, we only went to base camp. And I thought, wow, she's 15 and I'm feeling inadequate. And I said, wow, I commanded a formation in the Navy and I'm an admiral, but I said, your life sounds way more exciting. And no matter where I went and the interaction that I had with cadets, it was incredible. And I'm really pleased now that in retirement, I'm still involved with the program through the Navy League of Canada. And so I have an opportunity to see the benefits and to be able to play a role on the other side of the partnership that DND and the Canadian Armed Forces have with the leagues in supporting the programs. But it has an amazing impact. It's a free program. I have seen the benefits of the program firsthand, whether they were in Sea Cadets, Army Cadets, Air Cadets, or in the Junior Canadian Ranger programs. Incredible opportunities. And there are hundreds of thousands of Canadians who've had the benefit of that program and who attribute their success to the foundations they learned in that program.
So well put for sure, which is a great conduit now into what are you doing in the moment? Because I've, as I said, we've interacted many times. I think one of the last times we interacted, I was commanding the recruit school. You had come through either as a commodore or an admiral to inspect a recruit platoon. I remember turning my back at one point and you were gone in another direction. And I turned to the RCN and said, where is she gone? What's going on? So I know that you have a lot of energy and you like to keep moving. So what are you doing in the moment?
Well, I should probably start off with where I was after I saw you, because it then leads into what I'm doing now. Mm-hmm. I had the privilege of serving in two of the most important and I would say special roles as a reserve officer. One was to command the Naval Reserve as a Commodore, and it's also unique because that's the job that my father had when I joined the Naval Reserve, and so to have achieved that position was really special to me. In fact, the day of my change of command, incoming as the commander of the Naval Reserve, we broke my dad's pennant Unfortunately, my dad was no longer with us. He'd passed away the year before, but a real special family connection. And I thought at that point that that would sort of be the pinnacle of my career. And often people retired out of that job. I was very fortunate to have served in that role between 2007 and January of 2011. And in 2011, I was promoted and appointed as the Chief of Reserves and Cadets for Canada. And that's the senior reserve position in the entire reserve force. And you serve as an advisor to the Chief of the Defence Staff and the Minister. You have responsibility for reserve policies and programs, employer support, and the youth programs. Again, I thought after that job, my career would in the military would finish, and I was doing both of these jobs concurrently while teaching, and also I was in administration positions. I did that position until 2018, so 2011 to 2018 in National Defence Headquarters, and thought I would retire at that point, but I was extended beyond retirement age and given probably two jobs. Again, I go back to the philosophy of I wouldn't have chosen them. I had two of the hardest jobs of my career. The first one as leading the Canadian Armed Forces Strategic Response Team on Sexual Misconduct and starting Operation Honor. I had a second extension. Correction. I was Chief of Reserves and Cadets 2011 to 2015, and then took the job with the Strategic Response Team on Sexual Misconduct. In 2018, I was planning for retirement, and I was extended an additional year to lead the implementation of the LGBT purge class action settlement for members of the Canadian Armed Forces who'd been impacted by that. So I had two really, really hard jobs between 2015 and 2019. So in retirement, I was looking forward to changing pace and traveling the world. Who could have predicted a pandemic? Less than 90 days into my retirement, I retired in December of 2019. Great plans to see the world and put my feet up, and life changed. So during that time, I think it also allowed all of us to do some soul searching. I had been offered some consulting work. I thought I might work again after a break. So my plans changed quite a bit as a result of the pandemic. I didn't last very long in retirement before the phone started ringing from various organizations who'd been lying in wait, who tried to get me after they thought I was going to retire. I had 3 false starts for that. So phones started ringing either from organizations that my dad had been part of or that I had been associated with. And so I have taken on a lot of volunteer work, a lot of board work. And as you said, as you mentioned, I'm an active person, but as a Class A overachiever, I keep getting more loaded onto my plate, probably more than I'd like to be doing in retirement. But I've also had some really unique opportunities. I'm serving as a patron on the board for the Juno Beach Center. I'm serving on the National Board of the Navy League of Canada and working as the division president for the province of Ontario with the cadet programs. I'm working with on the board of the University Naval Training Division Association, working on morphing that organization to better represent Naval Reserve officers, all officer programs. And I'm looking forward to 2023, which is the centennial of the Naval Reserve and all of the events there. I do some speaking. Of course, I've had to change that style to do this electronically. It was kind of intimidating the first few times, but I'm still sharing my story and taking advantage of opportunities to mentor and to coach, to develop others. But I'm a little busier than I'd like to be. I'd like to have a little more time for some of my personal pursuits, but I'm keeping busy, and I think that's probably better than I would be bored. But I think the the pandemic for all of us gave us pause for reflection. And I'm still trying to decide what I'm going to be when I grow up.
Right. Well, yeah. I want to pick up on one thing. So we've indicated one failure in your career, and that's retirement. So you're not good at retirement. We understand that. But you'll be amazed at how many of our guests talk the same thing. And I think it's because we don't look at retirement in the same fashion as most other people. We stay engaged very much. So I want to pick up on one thing. I mean, you started off talking about, it was a summer job and that was it. Did you reflect on that when you walked in as the chief of reserve in cadets, that first meeting when they needed your advice? And did you think before you opened the door that this is a summer job at one point, and now look at it?
I did with every promotion I'd walk by the mirror and go, and I was asked, on one of the times I was retiring, we had twice a year, all of the general and flag officers of the Canadian Armed Forces got together for a symposium, and the chief of the defense staff would say farewell and sort of honor those who were retiring. And so he asked us each to speak and sort of sum up our career in one sentence. And my response to that was, best summer job ever. And because it was, and I think with each opportunity, and that's some of the advice that I give people, is to not sell yourself short. And when as a non-commissioned member and a communicator, when my career path was limited, I opened a different door to become an officer. As a logistics officer, when I didn't want to just be doing the books or counting the pop bottles in the canteen, I found other avenues. And it was interesting that in reflecting back, I probably wouldn't have chosen a lot of what I was tasked to do. But with each challenge, I also got greater confidence to see that I could step up. I really wanted to be, eventually as an officer, I really thought about commanding a Naval Reserve Division, and I had the pleasure of commanding at 3 different levels. I like you, commanded the recruit school in Borden, and commanded the formation of the Naval Reserve. But each time, yes, I laughed, and I sat at the table at Armed Forces Council, the highest governing body in the Canadian Armed Forces, and I'd shake my head, when the generals and admirals would turn to me and ask what I thought, and I told them. Oftentimes in no uncertain terms. I did have a few chief of defense staffs laugh and smile, because I was one of the few people who would speak my mind. Mm-hmm. They couldn't fire me, as a reservist. But yes, I did. And I still do. I look back. I still look back at it and think, wow, to go from ordinary Wren to rear-admiral in an organization, to have had that opportunity is pretty amazing. Mm-hmm. That they let me lead in that. But at the same time, it was also a privilege. Mm-hmm. And I don't think I ever overlooked that. It was really hard sometimes to face those challenges, but I knew that I had been prepared, and it was my opportunity to give back to an institution that had been incredibly good to me.
A tremendous impact you've made on the Canadian Armed Forces and the Navy, and really specifically the Naval Reserve. But you did all of this while balancing your own professional journey. This was just part of you. You had another career as well. And as you walked into the room, and I would argue that many of the people around the tables that you sat at had a career. That was it. But you were in there. This is, I don't want to say a part-time gig or a side hustle. This was a very important thing, but it was just part of you. The lens at which you look at situations must have been so different from everybody else.
And I think that was both interesting, but it was also welcomed. An example of that, when the Canadian Armed Forces was switching our fitness testing from what we had done before to the new force test, and going through the requirements and the science behind it. And there were kinesiologists briefing and folks talking about all of this. I would challenge them with questions. And I used to sat beside the Army commander at Armed Forces Council, and my boss was the vice chief of the defense staff, and the commander of the Navy was there, commander of the Air Force. And as I was asking these questions, they were all sort of looking at me and looking to see if I had notes, because the staff would always write your notes. They would tell you what to say. They'd script you at these meetings so that you didn't go off script. But I was asking these questions, and afterwards, one of them sort of said, "Wow, that was really interesting. You know, where you must have done a lot of research." And I said, "Well, that's what I do in my civilian life. I went through kinesiology and physical education." And I kind of looked, and it was sort of surprising with that. And I remember giving my resume to my civilian resume, as opposed to my bio, to Admiral McFadden when he was the commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, because I was aspiring to a job other than the Chief of Reserves and Cadets. There was an opportunity with the Canadian Defence Academy, which is the equivalent of the Ministry of Education for the Canadian Armed Forces. I had worked with the organization prior and had been the director of professional development, but I said I'd really like to be the commander of the Canadian Defence Academy. And he looked at my resume, and he said, "Wow." And he said, "Well, first off, in typical Canadian Armed Forces fashion, we'd never give you the job because you've actually worked in education. You know, we'd rather put a pilot or an engineer or someone in there." And it was sort of the first time that it hit him, what we bring to the table as reservists. And that's not unique to me. I think the Canadian Armed Forces is learning the value of that. And whether it's from what your civilian career was, or the languages you grew up speaking at home, the culture, what we bring from our community is really unique. And I take great pride in the fact that I did my entire career as a reservist, and most of it part-time as an after-supper sailor. And that is unique. And that I was given that opportunity and allowed to balance both by my civilian employers and in the military.
Fantastic. You know, Admiral, we always ask our guests to leave the audience with a piece of advice. You've had as I said before, a tremendous journey. Have touched so many people, have impacted the very fabric of this country in everything that you've done in the last number of years. And what would that piece of advice be?
It's hard to narrow it down to one. So if you will indulge me, I'll give you sort of some snapshots of how I advise people. The first is I'm going to use a Stephen Covey quote that is a good one that resonates, that says, "I'm not a product of my circumstances, I'm a product of my decisions." And I think the decisions that each of us make, and in my case, in that summer, to have decided to join the Naval Reserve, that was an incredible decision and a life changer. I think the other is to don't sell yourself short and underestimate yourself in anything that you do. I speak about silent mentoring and the power that people have just by being who they are. And I think your success isn't only contingent on what you achieve, and it's not what you're known as, it's what you're known for. Mm-hmm. And you have an opportunity to always be mentoring and advising and guiding and leading people just by who you are. And I probably should have paid more attention to that in my early days, but that always sort of stuck in the back of my mind, that you are influencing people and you can. I think it's really important as well, again, to be yourself. There's a great quote from Oscar Wilde that says, "Be yourself, everyone else is already taken." And to be true to yourself, that will help you in times of stress when you have to sort of default to who you are, and what you are. And as a leader, that's particularly important because then you're consistent and people know and understand and trust you. So as a woman, I advise that women don't have to lead like a man. You don't have to change your style. You can lead like a woman and still be successful in a male-dominated organization if you're true to yourself. So to go back to my don't sell yourself short, don't limit yourself. Look at the opportunities, get some advice, take the chances. And when opportunity doesn't knock and there isn't a door, then make your own opportunity.
100%. Jerry, your thoughts?
You're smiling, Alan. Alan told me, Jennifer, that be prepared. There's going to be some inspiration here. Holy Moses. Yes. First of all, I reflect on the foundation of my career being in the Navy. Yes, I did only spend 9 years there, but your conversation really brought me back to how important the Navy has been to the foundation of my career. In fact, I met my wife in the Navy. That's a whole other story that we'll tell at some other time. But, just a couple of things I like to take notes. Approachable leader, you said. The Navy allowed you to be you, and you kind of reiterated that in your voice. Isn't that just wonderful, being able to do that? You're a coach, you're a mentor. Challenge brought confidence. All these things are so interesting to hear. And I tell you, the other thing that I found fascinating, despite the fact I spent almost 10 years in the Navy, the whole busing and sailing piece with the Wrens, did not know that. So I'm sure many of our followers, who we hear from many of them, Alan, that have been in the Navy, that may be the first they ever heard of that themselves. So thank you for giving us a little history lesson, but also just being courageous to be you. Thank you for joining us.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you, and thanks for being interested in my story. As I say, it's very humbling when people ask where I started, and I know you're summing up, but with your indulgence, I will say that one of the most important pieces of advice as well about not only being yourself and creating opportunities is don't just get to the table and get a seat at the table, speak at the table and use that opportunity. And Al, I'm reflecting back on the time at recruit school, and one of the things I often got asked as a reviewing officer was, what do you ask them on parade? What are you talking about with them? And I did speak to all of them, and I annoyed coxswains who wanted me to speed along, or parade commanders. But I used to use that example about when someone asks you at the recruit school, how was the food or how was the program? Tell them, give them an honest answer, because that's the only way you can influence change. And so for people who achieve leadership positions and get a seat at the table, don't just sit at the table, use that opportunity and speak and influence change. And I think being bold that way, and at some point, because I was allowed to be me, while that may have been a shock to the system, and sometimes that also allowed me to have a voice and to use that voice. And I'm really pleased that it's influencing others to do that now. But thank you very much for having me join the illustrious group of the podcast, and for what you're doing to deliver these wonderful messages.
Well, another wonderful edition of Gale Force Winds, and what a privilege it has been to be in conversation with Admiral Jennifer Bennett, to look at the institution that is the Canadian Navy, the Canadian Armed Forces, through her lens today has been eye-opening. And the fact that women in this particular case that are now in the armed forces, in the Navy, and they couldn't even fathom the circumstances, that's a good thing. That shows that we are on the right path, because they couldn't even fathom not being in the same platoon, and nor should they. So you were a big part of bringing the institution where it is today. And the one thing that jumps out at me the most, and I've always said this about you, and I probably said it to your face a number of times, but you're very genuine, and people respond to that. When you speak to Admiral Jennifer Bennett, you get Admiral Jennifer Bennett. That's it. There's nothing hidden about it. That's the way it is. And you speak your mind, and people appreciate it, and you have a lot to add to the conversation. I can't imagine what it must have been like to walk through those doors of the upper echelons of the institution that is the Canadian Armed Forces, having started off as a summer job. I'm sure glad that Chief persisted to get you to join. There's so many people like that Chief out there that do their bit and have no idea what of an impact their conversation is going to have on the organization moving forward. And he did a great job. I'm so glad that you were part of it. I'm so glad that we were able to cross paths so much over the years. And I too like to leave the audience with my own piece of advice. And quite frankly, the world needs more Jennifer Bennett. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Gale Force Wins. That's Gale Force Wins, WINS.com.